Two legendary commanders, Georgy Zhukov, of the Soviet Union, and Heinz Guderian, of Nazi Germany, faced each other in one of World War II's most decisive and brutal confrontations. Their clash wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a war of intellect, endurance, and sheer willpower played out on frozen ground. Guderian's lightning blitzkrieg tactics met Zhukov's iron defense and calculated patience in a duel that would decide the fate of Moscow and perhaps the entire war. But did Zhukov truly outsmart Guderian, or was the German defeat the result of mistakes, weather, and Hitler's interference? The Eastern Front in 1941 was a theater of unimaginable destruction, where the German Wehrmacht surged forward with unstoppable momentum, and the Soviet Union fought desperately for survival. At the heart of this colossal struggle stood to military minds Guderian, the architect of blitzkrieg, who believed in speed and aggression, and Zhukov, the disciplined strategist whose resolve and planning became the backbone of Soviet resistance. As German forces advanced toward Moscow, Guderian's panzer divisions cut through Soviet lines with frightening precision, yet Zhukov refused to break, reinforcing every weak point with methodical precision and unyielding determination. Their confrontation near Moscow wasn't just another battle. It was the defining test of strategy and will, a moment where two distinct philosophies of war collided, one relying on shock and speed, the other on endurance and calculated timing. Heinz Guderian entered World War II with a reputation few could rival. Known throughout Europe as the architect of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that crushed Poland and France in record time. His genius lay in understanding how mobility and communication could replace brute force, turning tanks into the spearhead of fast, coordinated assaults. Guderian's command style was direct and confident, favoring initiative and autonomy among his officers rather than waiting for top-down orders. This approach gave him a psychological edge and made him a living symbol of Germany's early wartime success, a commander who seemed unstoppable. Yet by the summer of 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union tested even Guderian's unmatched tactical brilliance. Operation Barbarossa had started with astonishing speed, driving deep into Soviet territory and destroying entire armies within weeks. The German high command was intoxicated by victory, convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter. But Guderian, ever the realist, noticed the signs of trouble: endless distances, crumbling supply lines, and a resilient enemy refusing to die. At the same time, Georgy Zhukov was rising rapidly through the Soviet ranks. Having already demonstrated his strategic insight in the battles of Kholkhin Gol against the Japanese in 1939, was not a man of charm or diplomacy, but one of fierce discipline and calculated precision. His philosophy was built on the principles of endurance, coordination, and timing, emphasizing logistics and manpower over reckless speed. Stalin trusted few men, yet even he recognized Zhukov's rare ability to remain calm under pressure and to turn chaos into structure. As Guderian's tanks approached the heart of Russia, Zhukov was summoned to save Moscow, a task that seemed nearly impossible. The Red Army was battered and demoralized. Cities were burning, and German forces appeared unstoppable. Yet Zhukov saw opportunity in desperation: the vastness of the land, the harshness of the weather, and the overextension of the German advance. He immediately began transforming Moscow into a fortress, using every available resource to build defensive lines, dig trenches, and mobilize civilians for labor. Guderian's forces, meanwhile, had already proven their devastating efficiency in earlier months, executing massive encirclements around Smolensk and Kiev. These victories fed German confidence, but also consumed precious time, a resource even more vital than fuel or ammunition. Guderian understood that every delay brought winter closer, and winter favored the Russians who were born into its cruelty. Still, Hitler's obsession with capturing cities like Kiev diverted forces from the drive toward Moscow, forcing Guderian to obey orders he knew were strategically flawed. By the time Guderian turned north again, toward Moscow, in the fall of 1941, his men were exhausted and his tanks worn down by distance and lack of supplies. The roads had become quagmires of mud, swallowing vehicles and horses alike in the infamous Rasputitsa Russian season of mud that halted movement. Guderian's fuel trucks lagged hundreds of miles behind, and the Luftwaffe could not provide consistent air support as weather worsened. Despite these obstacles, he continued to push, driven by sheer determination and the belief that Moscow's fall would end the war. Zhukov, in contrast, was orchestrating a defense that reflected his mastery of both planning and psychology. He anticipated German routes of attack, reinforcing those sectors most vulnerable while hiding reserves in forests and behind natural barriers. He understood that German strength lay in rapid breakthroughs, so he created multiple layers of defense that could absorb and stall enemy momentum. The Zhukov victory would not come from annihilating the enemy in one blow, but from letting them exhaust themselves against unyielding resistance. The two generals represented opposite philosophies, molded by their nation's ideologies and experiences. Guderian's methods mirrored Germany's industrial precision and faith in technology, while Zhukov embodied the Soviet ideal of collective endurance and sacrifice. Each man fought not only an opponent but also the constraints of his political masters. Hitler's interference for Guderian and Stalin's paranoia for Zhukov. Their confrontation thus became more than a military duel. It was a test of systems, ideologies, and leadership under the weight of total war. As the German spearheads reached within striking distance of Moscow, morale in the Soviet capital plummeted. Government ministries evacuated, and panic spread among civilians who feared occupation was imminent. Even Stalin considered leaving the city, but Zhukov's confidence changed his mind. He promised the capital would hold a declaration that rallied not just soldiers, but an entire population to resist at any cost. By late November 1941, Guderian's Panzer Group II was stretched thin, attempting to maneuver across icy terrain under constant Soviet counterattack. The temperature dropped below -30°C, freezing lubricants in engines and immobilizing tanks. Hermann troops, ill-prepared for such cold, wrapped themselves in makeshift gear, stolen from Soviet civilians. What had begun as a lightning war had slowed into a frozen nightmare of attrition and fatigue. Zhukov seized this moment to exploit German weakness, with the same ruthless clarity that had defined his career. He ordered the mobilization of Siberian divisions, elite troops trained for winter warfare in Broadwest, after Stalin confirmed that Japan would not attack from the east. These fresh, well-equipped soldiers arrived like ghosts in the snow, their morale unbroken, their equipment superior for the conditions. They became the hammer that Zhukov would use to strike Guderian's weary lines. The counteroffensive began on December 5, 1941, under conditions that seemed almost impossible for combat. Soviet artillery opened a devastating barrage, followed by waves of infantry and tanks advancing through blizzards that blinded both sides. Guderian's formations were unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the attack, and their supply lines collapsed completely under pressure. For the first time, the German army faced a strategic retreat on the Eastern Front, a bitter blow to its reputation of invincibility. Despite Hitler's no-retreat order, Guderian chose to pull his men back to save them from annihilation. His decision was not cowardice, but a tactical necessity, reflecting his understanding that blind obedience would destroy his army. This act of defiance marked the end of his favor with Hitler, who dismissed him soon after. In contrast, Zhukov's success earned him immense prestige and solidified his position as the Soviet Union's most trusted military commander. The Battle of Moscow was more than just a defensive victory. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and turned the tide of the war psychologically. Guderian, the once unstoppable pioneer of blitzkrieg, found himself humbled by an enemy who fought not for speed but for survival. Zhukov proved that patience, logistics, and weather could defeat even the most advanced war machine. The contrast between them symbolized a broader truth, that wars are won not only by genius but by Still, to say Zhukov simply outsmarted Guderian would be an oversimplification. Guderian's genius had not vanished. It had been constrained by the flawed decisions of his superiors and the overconfidence of a regime that underestimated its enemy. His tactics remained sound, but the context had shifted beyond his control. Even brilliance can falter when starved of resources and freedom to adapt. Zhukov's victory, too, came at enormous cost, revealing the grim reality of Soviet warfare. Success measured not in efficiency but in sacrifice. His methods were harsh, often ruthless, as he demanded results regardless of losses. Soldiers respected him but also feared his uncompromising standards and willingness to execute failure. Yet it was this very severity that kept the Red Army from collapsing and ultimately turned defense into offense. While Guderian believed in mechanized precision, Zhukov mastered the art of organized chaos. He transformed weakness into strength by exploiting geography, morale, and timing, turning the vastness of Russia into an ally. Every delay, every kilometer gained by the Germans, became a trap that consumed their fuel and morale. When winter arrived, it was Zhukov who dictated the rhythm of the battle, using patience as his most lethal weapon. Historians have debated for decades whether the German defeat near Moscow was inevitable, or if Guderian could have triumphed under different circumstances. Some argue that if Hitler had allowed a direct drive on Moscow earlier, the city might have fallen before winter. Others insist that the Soviet defenses and logistics under Zhukov would have slowed the Germans regardless of timing. What remains undeniable is that the combination of Guderian's overextension and Zhukov's discipline timing created a turning point that reshaped the war. The personal contrast between these two men adds another layer to their story. Guderian was a thinker, often clashing with authority, favoring flexibility and innovation over blind obedience. Zhukov, though equally intelligent, thrived within strict hierarchy, channeling discipline into effectiveness. Both were products of their nations, one of technological ambition, the other of human resilience. When comparing their leadership under pressure, the difference becomes even clearer. Guderian valued initiative from his subordinates, encouraging commanders to seize opportunities as they appeared. Zhukov, however, demanded absolute coordination, believing that unity and control were essential in massive operations. Each approach reflected a different kind of intelligence, one the other systemic, and their collision at Moscow revealed which one could endure prolonged strain. The German command structure further undermined Guderian's chances by prioritizing Hitler's political goals over strategic sense. Hitler's obsession with holding every inch of ground, even when untenable, destroyed the army's ability to maneuver. Guderian's protests went ignored, leaving him in the impossible position of leading a mechanized force that could no longer move freely. Against this paralysis, Zhukov's calculated flexibility proved decisive, allowing him to exploit German rigidity at every turn. Zhukov's success at Moscow became the foundation for his later triumphs in Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin. His methods emphasizing depth, reserves, and overwhelming counterattack became central to Soviet strategy for the rest of the war. Guderian's legacy, though tarnished by defeat, survived in military theory as the man who defined modern mechanized warfare. Both men changed the nature of strategy, but only one could claim victory in their great confrontation. The lessons from their face-off extend beyond the battlefield. Zhukov demonstrated that mastery of logistics and timing could overcome technological inferiority. Guderian showed that even the most innovative tactics fail when misused or misunderstood by higher command. Together, their story illustrates the thin line between genius and defeat, where success depends as much on circumstance as on intellect. As winter deepened and the Germans retreated, the momentum of the war shifted irreversibly. The Soviets no longer fought for survival but for revenge, and Zhukov stood as the embodiment of that resolve. Guderian's removal from command symbolized the decline of German initiative on the Eastern Front. The age of lightning war was over, replaced by grinding attrition that favored the Soviet machine. In retrospect, Guderian's strategic vision was never fully realized because his environment punished creativity and rewarded obedience. He was a general who saw the future of warfare clearly, but was trapped in a system that could not adapt. Zhukov, by contrast, thrived in the chaos of a system that demanded absolute results, turning its brutal expectations into structured power. Their destinies diverged because one tried to defy authority, while the other mastered it. The aftermath of their confrontation changed both men profoundly. Guderian spent the remainder of the war in fluctuating roles, his independence viewed as a liability by Hitler's regime. Zhukov continued to rise, orchestrating victories that would carry him all the way to Berlin in 1945. Yet even in victory, he remained haunted by the immense human cost of his strategies, aware that every triumph had been purchased with rivers of blood. Looking back, it becomes clear that Zhukov's triumph over Guderian was not a matter of intellect alone but of adaptability under crushing pressure. He understood the rhythm of war, when to resist, when to counterattack, and when to sacrifice. Guderian's brilliance, though unquestionable, was bound by his refusal to accept political realities, a flaw that ultimately doomed his campaigns. Thus, history recorded Zhukov as the victor, but both men stood as tragic figures in a war that devoured even its geniuses. In the frozen landscapes outside Moscow, two philosophies met and tested the limits of human endurance. Guderian fought to prove that speed and innovation could conquer vastness, while Zhukov proved that patience and discipline could resist even the most modern army. Their battle became a symbol of the entire Eastern Front, relentless, brutal, and decided as much by weather and will as by tactics. What survived after the smoke cleared was not just a military victory but a lesson in the complexity of leadership under fire. When viewed through the lens of history, Zhukov's defense of Moscow stands as one of the greatest counteroffensives ever executed. It was not perfect, nor was it bloodless, but it redefined the balance of power in the Second World War. Guderian's defeat, though painful, reshaped military theory and taught generations that no plan survives without adaptability. Together, these men carved their names into the annals of history, one as a symbol of resilience, the other as the embodiment of speed and innovation, cut short by circumstance. And so, the question remains, did Zhukov truly outsmart Guderian? In pure tactical brilliance, perhaps not entirely. Guderian's intellect was unmatched in maneuver warfare, but in the grand test of endurance, timing, and adaptation to chaos, Zhukov emerged superior. His ability to turn weakness into strength defined the Soviet victory, while Guderian's failure to break free from political and logistical chains sealed his fate in the snows of Moscow. The clash between Georgy Zhukov and Heinz Guderian stands as one of the most revealing episodes in the entire history of warfare. It was more than a contest of tactics. It was a confrontation between two visions of how wars should be fought and won. Guderian represented the boldness of innovation, the belief that speed, precision, and mechanical coordination could dominate the battlefield. Zhukov, in contrast, embodied the quiet power of endurance, the conviction that discipline, preparation, and timing could defeat even the swiftest of enemies. In the aftermath of Moscow, both men's reputations would evolve in ways that reflected the systems they served. Guderian's brilliance was eventually overshadowed by the collapse of the Nazi regime and the strategic misjudgments of Hitler's leadership. He became, in many ways, a symbol of what happens when genius is trapped within tyranny, unable to act freely or strategically. Zhukov, on the other hand, became the Soviet Union's military icon, celebrated as the man who saved Moscow and later delivered Berlin, though he would also experience Stalin's suspicion and temporary demise. The legacy of their face-off goes beyond personal triumph or failure. It reveals timeless truths about leadership, adaptability, and the human cost of ambition. Zhukov's victory was not achieved through brilliance alone, but through his ability to align his strategy with the realities of his environment, the harsh winter, the vast terrain, and the unbreakable morale of his soldiers. Guderian's defeat, while often attributed to weather or political interference, also came from a deeper limitation: his reliance on speed in a situation that demanded patience. In that difference lay the heart of the battle's outcome and the essence of what made Zhukov's triumph so enduring. What makes their story fascinating is that both generals, despite their differences, were prisoners of the same truth, that no single doctrine guarantees success. When war becomes total, Guderian's tanks could not outrun supply shortages or frozen oil. Zhukov's infantry could not triumph without unimaginable sacrifice. Each man understood his craft perfectly, yet both were shaped and scarred by forces larger than themselves. History, therefore, does not simply crown one as the victor and the other as the loser, but reminds us that even great commanders are bound by time, terrain, and the flaws of human systems. Today, when military historians revisit the winter of 19, they see in Zhukov and Guderian not just opponents, but reflections of two eternal principles of warfare: momentum and endurance. The lesson of Moscow is that speed must serve a sustainable strategy, and endurance must be guided by vision. Guderian's legacy lives in modern armored warfare, inspiring doctrines of mobility that continue to influence armies worldwide. Zhukov's influence endures in the art of defense, reminding leaders that patience, preparation, and willpower can overturn even the most aggressive offensive. Ultimately, the story of Zhukov and Guderian is not about who was smarter, but about who adapted better when certainty vanished. Guderian's genius thrived in clarity and movement, while Zhukov's strength emerged from ambiguity and persistence. The victory outside Moscow was, therefore, not merely a Soviet triumph, but a victory of endurance over haste, of realism over overconfidence. And as history would later show, it was also the moment when the myth of Nazi invincibility began to crumble, reshaping the course of the entire war. When the snow finally melted and the smoke cleared, both generals stood as enduring symbols of their nation's good. The visionary trapped by a failing empire, and Zhukov, the survivor who turned struggle into victory. Their legacies remind us that war is as much a test of mind as of machine, and that intellect untempered by adaptability often leads to ruin. In the endless debate over who truly outsmarted whom, the answer lies not in one decisive maneuver, but in the outcome of endurance itself. Zhukov won because he understood that in war, patience and resilience are sometimes the sharpest weapons of all.